today's episode, we are going to be talking about how to sell off an ADU as a condominium. In other words, how to turn an ADU into a condo that you can sell separately if you want to. Now, the reason we're talking about this is California just passed a law recently where now you can take an ADU, turn it into a condo, which you can sell off separately, completely separately. Now, I talked to my friend at How to ADU, and what he told me was that in California, obviously it's fairly new, so there's still going to be some kinks that we have to work through. However, in other states, this has already been going on. So I wanted to bring on John Blackman to talk to us about what this process is like in Austin, Texas. That way us Californians can get a little bit of insight and then plan to sell off ADUs as condos. Welcome to the show, John. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun. I love building ADUs and all of the trials and tribulations that come with them, at least here in Austin.
I love it. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about just what is the process for turning an ADU into a condo conversion. We'll talk about like HOAs. We'll talk about CC&Rs. We'll talk about the bylaws, just step-by-step process. So make sure to watch until the end. So let's get started with this. What is the process like? Like most people by now have a basic understanding of what an ADU is, but if I wanted to convert an ADU into a condo, do I have to do that at the very beginning before I build the ADU? Or if I already have an ADU, can I turn that into a condominium at this point?
Yeah, I mean, you can do it both ways. I have only ever done it the first way, where I have a blank slate and I say, hey, I'm going to build something back here that's going to be an ADU, or I'll have an empty lot and I'll build two buildings and I have to decide like, hey, do I want to do a side-by-side kind of duplex sort of thing, or do I want to do two houses about the same size, or do I want to do a front house that's big and a small house that's the ADU in the back? And in Austin, at least, this came out because we've had our code next problems, which is Austin's, ability, or like they're trying to redo their development code that's been the same since the 80s, and they can never get enough political support to change it. So they kind of release these kind of little hacky laws that say like, well, we can't pass this big overhaul, but we'll do this little thing that will kind of, maybe help a little bit. So the ADU law was passed, I think it was 2016, I want to say, but it allows building up to an 1,100 square foot building has to be in the back half of the property. And then you can sell it off separately only under a certain special set of conditions. Now, those conditions are probably going to be different in Los Angeles. So I can only speak to what they are here in Austin. But here, you have to have enough access for a driveway. So if you want to build an ADU in the back of your house and you can't fit a driveway past the house to the back house, then that's kind of a non-starter. And then it also has to fit within the regular setbacks. So in Austin, they're 10 feet from the back and 5 feet from the right, 5 feet from the left. And you've got to be able to figure out how you're going to get your utilities up there, which generally isn't that much of a problem, although it does tear up the street and stuff when you put in drain lines and that sort of thing. But the real secret to the sauce is being able to create a condo association. And what I call that, it's like a poor man's subdivide. So the subdivision process is really long. I just finished one subdivision process here in Austin, like literally 2 weeks ago. It took me 3.5 years, 3 years and 5 months. And then I have another one that I'm on year 6, maybe even year 7 with. That's in the county, but these things can be very, very onerous depending on the size. So even though they've passed a lot of these new laws that say, oh, you can use smaller lots, like it depends on if they still make it super hard to subdivide, because if it's going to take 18 months to 2 years to subdivide, just no one's going to do it. So they make these condo associations instead. And so Austin is full of these little 2-unit condo associations everywhere that have a full set of condo docs, right? That read just like a big condominium building, but there's only 2 units.
That's great. So let me ask you this, like, what's the main difference, just for our viewers, what's the main difference between like building an ADU and then subdividing it to be able to sell it off separately and just doing the condo? And what are the pros and cons of each one?
Sure. So again, a lot of this depends on how your zoning works in Los Angeles. In Austin, they have different types of zoning for residential. There's SF1, 2, and 3. SF2 and SF1, you can't put a condo association on, but SF3 you can. Most things in Austin are SF3. So that's kind of like the first requirement that, hey, can I put a condo association on it? And then 2, if Again, a lot of it depends on like the trees and where you can fit the building and if there's power lines. So you have to play the Jenga game of like, can I actually fit what I want to fit in the back part of the property? Now, if you want to sell it all as a single project, you can do that. You can do that on SF1 and SF2 and SF3. So like, let's say you can't get a driveway back there, but you want to build your ADU in the back. But then you have to sell the whole thing as just one unit. It's got one tax ID. But when you create that condo association, it now has two tax IDs, right? And so that's really the key distinction. And so once you get that second tax ID, you can get that with a subdivide, or you can get it with the condo association. But a condo association can be written up by a good attorney in like a couple of weeks. And you've got to get surveys and all that kind of good stuff to specify, where the bordering line is and all that jazz. But then once you build it, then now you can, if you own both sides, you can just own them and rent them and do whatever you want with them. But once you have that separate property ID and separate tax ID, now title can insure it because title says like, okay, well, this is its own property. I can now transfer that to someone else.
So basically, at that point, if it's its own property and it's a condo association, you can basically sell it off. Basically, so you can either decide to hold both of them personally, or you can say, "Hey, look, like I want to sell it off and pay off my primary residence if I want to do that." Basically, what are these? Because it's funny because by the beach over here where we're at, there's these like 4-unit complexes that became 4-unit condo associations. Like normally it's a lot larger, but that's probably like the closest thing. And I've seen some in Santa Paula, which is another city down here, where it's like a 2-unit condo association. What is required to basically create a condo association? Are there dues that have to be paid at least out in Austin, Texas? If so, like what are the dues? Like what are some of the different things that you have to like outline as to who's responsible for what, or how does that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny because it's the same old condo conversion game, just done at a smaller scale, right? So I'm sure
Hmm.
you've seen like apartment buildings get turned into condos and then they get sold off, one by one.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
depending on the business cycle, like someone will buy up all the condos and then turn them into a big multifamily building. So just depending on the environment, they get converted back and forth depending on how the numbers work best, right? And so this is
Hmm.
the exact same thing, just at a smaller scale. And so, I mean, I would say I'm not an attorney, but I have one write up the condo docs. But in general, as a developer, I want to make those docs as simple and low cost as possible. And so that's what I would suggest if you're doing it yourself, because as soon as you start putting in like, hey, look, you got to pay $80 a month for like the solar panel maintenance and like the garden gnomes out front or whatever it is you're going to do, then it's just more for them to object to. Plus, they're usually so small that you don't really have any common amenities to keep track of. So it's not like you've got a pool or a lot of grounds to keep up or a lot of fence maintenance or things like that. And because they're also separate buildings and they don't share a wall, then like each side can take care of their own roof and things like that. So generally speaking, I have always seen them be very, very lightweight. So almost all of them are zero fee, right? It's like, look, you just take care of your stuff. I'll take care of my stuff. And then we just agree not to mess with each other. And then you sell your thing, I can sell mine, and it's just like a separate property.
Have you noticed that? Because like in California, like prices are pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when people look at a house, they're like, wow, like why would I pay like $800,000 for that? But now if you can build an ADU for $200 a foot, 1,000 square feet, that's 200,000. And
Yeah.
if you can sell that off for 600,000,
Mm-hmm.
now that $800,000 property doesn't seem that expensive. So it's
Yeah.
almost like because of these laws, I'm noticing that it's bringing up values in California. Are you noticing something similar in Austin where it's caused values to increase? Where now people, when they're analyzing deals, are analyzing them as the potential that it has as well, too.
Yeah. I mean, I call it the golden backyard, right? So if your backyard is has the right conditions, like you've got
Hmm.
access to it from the street, or you have enough space to get that car back there. Like the best
Hmm.
ones are corner lots, so that way you can come at the lot from the other street if you're right on the corner, and you don't have enough any trees that would prevent development, because trees also will stop you from putting what you want in there, depending on the type of the tree and the size. Then yeah, I mean, there's kind of two ways to do it. One is you could just sell off your backyard to a developer. I've bought backyards before. I love that. That's great. like they're able to get some money, and I put up a fence, and it looks like two houses, and you never know any of the wiser. It looks just fine. Um, Other people might want to build their own and then sell it, but building a property is it's a process, and it's a lot of headache,
Yeah.
and so
Hmm.
you've got to have the right temperance for it. I remember my first new build, I was just a wreck, right? It was terrible, right? But like anything else, after you've done it once or twice, the things that used to freak you out are kind of like, yeah, I've seen cracked foundations a dozen times now. This is what you do to fix it, right? Or, oh yeah, there's a giant, hole here that we're going to have to fill, and we've got to connect the sewer line, and we're going to need a grinder pump, and like we got to go around this thing, and like, oh, we've got to move utilities over this way, and all sorts of stuff can go wrong. But it's just like, oh yeah, you've dealt with it before. So the first one is always the scariest. But you have a lot of people who have this scenario where they're in the position to do that. So if they're willing to go through the process of permitting and building a house in their backyard, then yeah, it can be very lucrative. I think the area where people get into trouble is they just don't know all the regulations, and they might not know like what makes it accessible, and also making sure that they know the market, so that, hey, if you build a super cheap ADU like a Amazon.com drop-in container home, like you're not going to sell that thing for $600,000 when you're done. It's got to be on slab, stick frame, like nice finish outs, like it's a house. It's just a small house.
I got it. Let me ask you this: like in Austin, is there like, for example, I have a home in a community where the minimum lot size is an acre. Like you can't subdivide it for less than an acre, and I just happen to be on an acre, so I can't subdivide it.
Yeah.
Would that be a workaround, like the condo association potentially?
Mm.
Because I'm not subdividing it, I'm basically like the minimum lot size is an acre because of the condo conversion. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, here, that would be like if you're in the county instead of in the city. And there's
Yeah.
a similar rule here. The lot acre size minimum is, or the lot minimum size is 1 acre in the county. And so you can't
Hmm.
do anything smaller than that. There have been people that have tried to do creative things where like they condo out the land.
Hmm.
A couple of people are trying that, and it's causing some friction with the county, because it's like, well, technically it works, but the county's never seen anyone do it. So they don't really kind of know how to respond and react to it. So anytime you go up against an entrenched organization that has a certain way of doing things, if you try something new, like you just prepare yourself
Gonna
for a
get
long
pushed back.
battle, and you may not get it done, and you may spend a lot of time for them to ultimately say no. So if you're in the county like that, I would imagine that it would be difficult to sell it off separately if their lot minimum is 1 acre,
One
unless you
acre.
could condo it. But I mean, typically a condo association is something that you do in a zoned district, and not in like a county area. But it depends. Like you would have to ask your county development office, like, hey, can I condo out a piece of a quarter acre out of my acre and sell it separately?
Yeah.
My guess is they're going to say no.
Who owns the land when you condo it out? Like
uh,
meaning like does the land is still owned by the acre, or is that 25 quarter of an acre because it's condo now owned by the person who owns a condo? Because I've heard that in condominiums you don't actually own the land,
yeah.
or in PUDs. So
Hmm.
any insight on that?
Yeah. Again, it depends on how the condo docs are written. Because you think of like timeshares and things like that, where you don't own the land, you just own like the little box on the tower, and that's yours. Um, Generally speaking, with ADUs, you do own the land. But again, I could imagine a scenario where you don't. If you had a creative
The
real estate,
HOA documents
yeah,
say
you had
that.
a creative real estate attorney that says you don't own the land, you just own the house, and I don't know, you pay a fee for renting the land. I mean, you can get all sorts of creative with it, like a mobile home park sort of thing. I've never seen that done, but I suppose it's possible. But typically speaking, like when I do ADUs, I'm doing them in the city typically, and so
Mhm.
it's on zoned land. And then when I split it, the owners own the land underneath.
I love it. I love it. Now, when you said that you sell off the land, you said that you've sold, or not sell off the land, that you've bought land from other people, like their golden backyard.
Yep.
Basically, you've bought it.
Yep.
Is that on a condo conversion, or is that like on a subdivision that you've done it?
Yeah, so you can do it both ways. I prefer the condo conversion just because it's faster and easier, like by
Okay.
an order of magnitude. You can get a
Uh-huh.
condo doc recorded in like a couple of weeks, whereas that subdivision is going to take you 18 months. Um, So in that case, what I do is I condo out the land, and then I have a survey with an empty backyard, and I'll put like a to be built, footprint for a site plan for what I'm going to do there, and then you record it, and then after you record it, there's a closing, and then so then I pay the seller the amount, and then I close on the new property ID after the condo docs are recorded, and that's that.
What does that look like in Austin? Like, meaning, like, let's say that they bought the house. Like, what is the house worth today, and how much is the land actually worth? Like, selling it off? Because I'm imagining, I don't know if that's going to be possible in California, but let's say somebody buys an $800,000 home, they sell the golden backyard for
Mhm.
200. They really only paid 600,000.
Yep.
Obviously their backyard is smaller, but then if you get something with a much larger lot, then that might be worth it. Like, what can somebody expect to pay out there for the golden backyard versus if you just buy the entire property?
Yeah, it depends on the area, right? Like Old Torf Street is kind of like the demarcation line for South Austin. North of that is a lot more expensive than south of that. Like if I were to buy a lot around Old Torf Street or north of that, it's probably going to be around 800,000 just for the dirt. If you go south of Ben White 71,
How
those
much would the house be worth though? Like, how much would the entire property be worth if I wasn't just buying the land? I guess that's what I'm
it
looking at.
depends on the house that's on it, right? So the where this tends to happen the most is where you have houses that are like built in the 40s and they're small and they're on 8,500 square foot lots, which back in 45 or whatever when the house was built was perfectly normal, big backyards. But now because the values have gone up so much, you might buy something that's dilapidated and is effectively a tear down, and pay $800,000 for the house
For the
and the dirt.
house.
But really, what you're buying is the dirt. And then what happens is someone will scrape that house, and if you build just one house on it, depending again on the location, you might put, I don't know, like 1 million or 1.5 million into the house, and then you might sell that house for 3 or 4 million, right? So I
Yeah.
imagine the numbers are somewhat similar in different parts of Los Angeles. For the backyard, again, it depends. In that situation, you might say like, "Hey, look, I'll buy the back, 4 or 5 thousand,
4,000.
square feet of your 8,000 foot lot. Not even that. I could get by with much less, like 3,000 square feet, right, of an 8,500 square foot lot, and I could buy that for 200 or 250, right? And then you'd build the house on top of it, and the house might cost you 350, 400. So now you're in it for like 650 or so, and then you sell the ADU for 800, something like that. Again, these are all like fingers in the air sort of thing. It depends on the lot. Building prices change, depends on your finish outs, depends on your location, right? But that's just kind of like a high level example of what builders are doing around here for sure.
Yeah, no, and it helps me because I'm like, I never thought about like somebody could potentially sell off their land as a potential condo conversion and have somebody else completely build it. If that's the case, then people are going to factor that into the price because they're like, hey, I don't want to pay 800, but I'm good with 600. At that point, they could just sell a portion of the land. Let me ask you this: how is the financing for these like small 2 unit condos? Like, are there specific lenders that finance on these properties, or is it just traditional Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac type of financing, FHA, conventional,
Yeah, you can
etc.?
get Freddie Fannie money on them because they are separate, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they at least when I've gotten loans on them for my buyers when I've sold these things, all of the lenders that I've worked with have said like, look, it's a freestanding condo, so it doesn't have any shared expenses. We show them the condo docs, so because there's only two, and there's always that rule of like, hey, you have to have above a certain percent that's owner occupant to finance it because you don't want to have too many tenants and that sort of thing. And a lot of times that 50% rule will violate that because there's only two. But most lenders that I've worked with, they look at it as a single family home because it's a separate structure and it doesn't share any walls. And so they go, okay, yeah, it's a condo association, but really it's two houses on one lot. And as far as financing underneath, like the dirt, like I always recommend, like, look, you just buy the dirt underlying in cash. Like, don't have a loan on the dirt. It just makes things too complicated.
Does it cost money to maintain the HOA? Like, meaning, like, let's say you pay for all your own things, I pay for my own thing. Is there like a yearly fee, like, or a yearly audit, or a yearly, like, some sort of
So
regulatory?
here's the thing: if you collect money, then it costs more, right? Because now you have to set up a bank account and you've got to share
Yeah.
expenses and all that stuff. But really, the condo association docs are just, I mean, they're almost just like a legal formality that separates the two, but you
Hmm.
want them low cost as possible. So at the end of the day, it still works like two houses next to each other, right? So there's no reason to have any real shared expenses. You don't have a common sign, you don't have common mailboxes, you don't have common anything, right? So the costs, I always make them zero. And most of the time when I see them, they're always zero. So there's
Got
nothing
it.
to maintain. You just, the two sides have to agree. So if they ever want to change anything in the docs, then both sides have to say yes. There's no majority because it's just two. And the most common term that comes up that people care about are whether or not you can do short-term rentals
On the
on either side.
on either side.
Right.
Is that possible in Austin or no?
You can totally do short-term rentals in Austin, but HOAs can stop them. So if your HOA says no short-term rentals, then you can't do them.
So basically, and that could be something that's created by, like, let's say I subdivided my acre, or not subdivided, I turned the ADU into a condo and I didn't want short-term rentals there. I can write the bylaws to basically say, hey, look, there's no short-term
Yep.
rentals in there.
Yep.
Which could affect the value or whatever, or the desirability, or could make it better. Who are the players that you need on this? So you're going to need a land surveyor or no land surveyor?
Oh yeah.
Or
yeah.
you're going to need. So who are the different players that you would need to do this?
The same ones for any build, really. The only kind of extra piece is the attorney to create the condo docs, because typically you don't need that for regular construction. But otherwise, you need your architects, you need your civil engineers to do all the water sewer stuff. You need a good builder, right? And those are the key ones. Then you need all the vendors, of course, that you're going to need to do all that stuff. And you're going to have to do a couple of surveys. So one at the beginning, a pre-split survey, a split survey, then a form survey, then an as-built survey, and then a final condo survey. So the surveyors, they've got a good business model. You need to call them a lot.
Yeah. What are the costs out in Austin to build an ADU, like per foot, or does that even is that even a thing out there? Like out here, I think it's anywhere from maybe 175 to maybe 300 or 400, just depending on the quality of the finishes.
Yep. Yeah. Same here. Right. I start with about 250 is kind of my starting point, and that's including hiring a GC. So if you're doing it without a GC, well, then you could do it closer to 200 instead of 250 if you're doing it yourself, right?
Got it. Cool. Anything else that you think would be helpful as it relates to converting ADUs into condominiums?
Well, I mean, it just depends on how you convert it. If you have built an ADU previously and you're like, hey, I want to convert it and sub it out, that's one approach. You just get the condo docs. But I always, when I talk to people, I'll say, what's your end goal, right? So if it's after the fact, okay, well, you're kind of trying to back convert something you've already done. And so you just got to make sure can you sell what you're trying to sell? Like I was saying before, if you put something that's, not really necessarily a full house, like maybe it's just a studio or it doesn't have a kitchen, it needs to be a full home. And if you're going to sell something that's manufactured, that's going to value very differently than something that's stick built. Right. And then also your access matters a lot too. So if, hey, you kind of have to jank it so that the driveway doesn't really fit and you can barely squeeze by, or that it's got some limitations to it, just make sure you're comparing apples to apples, because there can be a lot of subtle differences and inconveniences with ADUs depending on how they're laid out, because they're so tightly packed. They're not all the same. Right.
And then I would imagine it also becomes more complex if you have common walls as well too. So if for example, it's attached versus a completely detached, it would almost make it a lot simpler, because once it's attached, then you have common roof, then you have common pipes, and then that's where you probably need to have some fees there in case something does go wrong there, basically.
And honestly, then it becomes a duplex, right? If it's attached, then it's a single structure duplex. Now you can do the same thing. You can build a duplex condo and sell an A half and a B half. But those, you're right, you do get sometimes common shared expenses, usually for things like the roof, or you just agree to split expenses that happen between walls and that sort of thing.
I love it. Cool. John, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, or somebody's looking to do something in Austin, how would people be able to contact you? And do you offer any sort of coaching as well too, or anything that you do to help people, or where can people find you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the easiest place to find me is just johnblackman.com. And you can look that up on YouTube. I have a channel called Building Time Freedom, where I talk about building and ADUs and even regular houses that aren't ADUs. So you can find me there pretty easily. I do have some coaching stuff if people are interested in that. So yeah.
I love it. Cool. John, I want to say thank you for taking the time to be on the show. This actually got my brain running in just different directions. I'm like, man, no wonder prices have increased a lot. And I believe that with this, if this does take place over the next couple of years, it'll likely increase more because people are going to be factoring that into a lot of their valuation. So if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit the subscribe button. If you feel that this episode would be helpful, make sure to hit that share button. Once again, we had John Blackman. We talked about how to sell off an ADU as a condo and how to turn an ADU into a condo that you can sell separately. Thanks again, John. And to our viewers, until next time.